honoured guest tonight is a very special person, Peter Hensman, who some of you will know, who is a very celebrated figure in Cumbria and has many different roles. He's here because he's the chair of the Lake District Estates and has had that role for many years. He's had intimate involvement with the estates for over 40 years. You're involved also with the Bremen Glass and Extel Railway in Peter Rabbit and shop, trustee of the Lake District Foundation, and has had many honorary roles. So it's quite a privilege for us to have him here. He sort of personally holds many of the archives of the iconic Ullswater Steamers. We're all privileged in this community to use the steamers and to love the steamers. One of my daughters got married not on the steamer, but hired a steamer for the occasion prior to the wedding. It was a very special event, and the steamers have been very kind to the Friends of the Ullswater Way, particularly in the launch just recently, in September last year, I should say, of the Ullswater Heritage Knowledge Bank, which and they offered to provide us a very fitting setting for the launch of that bank. So please welcome very much Peter. We're going to I will now pass the floor to him. Is there a technologist in the house? Because we tried this little device. It looks very simple, doesn't it? Just to assist Peter to go through the slides, and I can't work. That's the way it goes. So I'm going to be playing the piano.
And I'll wake you up.
I'll be playing the piano whilst he talks, and he'll give me a nod or whatever time we need to do a slide. So without further ado, I'll pass to Peter.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you all for coming to listen this evening. Because I feel that most of you will probably know more about this subject than I do, because my family only became involved in the steamers in 1954, and they all started back in 1855. So it was 100 years before we were involved. And that period, I have to rely on what is published elsewhere. And so I suspect many of you have all sorts of bits and pieces and are better informed than I am. I may be able to talk better from the sources I have from the later years, but then you remember most of those anyway. So that will just be a canter over things you already know, which is always very comforting to be told what you already know. So that's all right. So I won't, it's quite long, this, and if you feel you need to get up and stretch your legs in the middle, please do, I shan't be worried. But I'm going to go into it straight away. And the story of the Ullswater steamers really has never been one of plain sailing. A story full of difficulties and controversy. But it begins, I think, really with the Greenside lead mines. We've got to go back to those. Mining probably began, as you all know, in the Greenside in the 18th century. And the company to exploit the mines was formed in 1925. And they developed some extensive work. It's the first slide. How exciting. Okay, you got him. Extensive work. It's just a picture of what it became. By 1842, they grew rapidly. By 1842, there were 99 miners and 49 people in subsidiary trades. Next slide, please. Some of those people. The mine, over its life, produced 150,000 tons of lead and 45 tons of silver. Silver was a byproduct of the process. And at its peak, it was producing 1,600 tons per annum. But the problem was getting it out. There was no easy way in those days in and out of Glenridding, or as it was called then, Patterdale. Glenridding doesn't seem to have been adopted as a name for this area until a bit later. The roads to Penrith were full of potholes, and they made special carts to get the metal out, but they used to get bogged down in the muddy roads. And the next slide, please. Stybarrow Crag in those days tumbled straight down into the lake. And so to get round it, travellers had to go and use paths, what one source described as dangerous rocky paths requiring the bravest of horses. And there wasn't a road through. The next slide, please. That road, the main road, which you see there now, wasn't put through till late the 1890s. So they had difficulty. That was the big problem, was getting the stuff out. So they thought they should use the lake as transport, a better way for that. And it would also begin to cater for the growing tourist interest in the area. So Ullswater Steam Navigation Company, which was the first company, was formed in 1855, and it was incorporated in 1859. In 1859, they put out a tender for a 70-foot long, 18 horsepower paddle steamer. It was ordered from Liverpool. That's fine, yes, that'll do. We'll come to it. It was ordered from Liverpool shipbuilders Jones Quiggin and delivered by rail to Penrith. And here is an extract from an article by Robert Beale, which described what happened. Enterprise was transported to Penrith railway station, where she was temporarily stored in mid-May 1859. She was then transported to the lake, where she was riveted together. Landings were secured for her at Lyle's Tower, as well as Patterdale, Howtown and Pooley Bridge, where a 90-foot pier was to be constructed. The proprietor of the Sun Hotel saw the potential and started an omnibus service between Penrith railway station and the pier at Pooley Bridge. Prior to the launch, the vessel was to be called the Dalmain, in tribute to the Lord of the Manor. And it was originally planned to be launched on the 20th of June, but this was delayed until the 16th of July. So on a very hot Saturday, 16th of July, the stage was set for the launch close to where the River Eamont leaves the lake. The Carlisle Patriot carried the story. Several hundred spectators gathered to witness an operation novel to the inhabitants of these dales, the inland navigation of Ullswater having hitherto been restricted to skiffs and oarboats and a light yacht or two. A party with a band of music were present from Penrith, and boat after boat came down the lake with its load of passengers until the lower reach assumed almost the appearance of a regatta. The launch took place without the engine, which had not yet arrived. At 2 o'clock, therefore, when the expectations of the spectators reached their full height, Mrs. Slee of Tyrrell was conducted to the platform at the bow to perform the ceremony. The last wedge that kept her on the slips was knocked out, and as the boat began to move, the fair sponsor dashed the customary bottle of wine against the bow and named her the Enterprise. I don't know what happened to the Dalmain. Thus christened, the boat glided gracefully into the blue waters of the lake amidst the cheers of the onlookers. The impetus carried her halfway across, and as she righted with her head to the wind and began to drift downwards, she was taken in tow by several boats and brought to the place where she is to be completed. After the launch, a celebratory meal was held at the Sun Inn to toast the success of the new venture. That's the slide in part. So then a trial for shareholders with the engine took place, as they got it in by then, quite soon afterwards, on the 28th of July, when the Yeomanry Cavalry Band on board. Enterprise completed a tour of the lake and returned for a grand public banquet at the Sun Inn. Special trains were laid on from Carlisle and Kendal. And the Carlisle Patriot continued their story then. A commodious vessel with accommodation of superior character. She sailed swiftly and steadily, and although arrangements for landing passengers and the discipline of the crew are not yet completed, with a little experience or two of two or three or more trips, there can be no doubt she will provide another great source of attraction to this beautiful location. And So then, yeah, that's right. The next slide, thank you. There she is on the pier at Patterdale. That was to talk about again in a minute, but you can just see the paddles on either side. As well as passengers, she brought in food and provisions, and she took coal, timber, and explosives for the mine, and she brought the Royal Mail as well. And she took out silver and lead. But Enterprise has always been described as ill-fated. Wherever you look, she's ill-fated, unsatisfactory, underpowered. She was only 16 horsepower, which is sort of 6 small outboard motors. So she was blown by the winds, and her paddles clogged with weeds and other things. And there is a story of haycocks getting into the lake and completely clogging the thing up. So she was generally unreliable. And by the 1870s, Thomas Cook was developing his tourist business, and he wanted reliability so he could show the Victorian tourists the grandeur and beauty of Ullswater. So in 1877, a new steamer was ordered, propeller-driven, designed by Douglas Hensman of Penrith, and built by T.B. Seath in Glasgow. He was a prefabricated vessel specialist and had built boats for the African lakes, so we were particularly privileged. She had a riveted cast iron hull, and she weighed 45 gross tons. She was 97 foot long, and she had a 4-cylinder, 32 horsepower steam engine. Now, I give you these details because some years ago, I was kindly invited to the Outward Bound when Prince Philip came. And I was introduced as being something to do with Ullswater Steamers. And he said, oh, that's interesting. He said, what do they weigh? I'm sorry, I haven't got a clue, sir. Well, how long are they? I'm sorry. So he sort of wandered off. I mean, here was a complete nincompoop. So now whenever I refer to a steamer, I do put in their tonnage and their length. But this vessel was brought by train to Penrith, by horse-drawn dray to Waterside Farm Slipway, where she was reassembled. But there was controversy from the start. I read here from a letter to the editor of the local paper in May 1877. I'm sure that the public generally, as well as the residents near Ullswater, will hear with much surprise the name which is to be given to the new boat. At the meeting of directors and shareholders held at Crown Court, Pooley, the name Penrith Castle was decided on by a majority of 1. The name which ought to be given should undoubtedly be in keeping with the beautiful scenery that the boat has to plough. Maid of the Mist, Osprey, Blencathra, Fairy Queen, Lady of the Lake, Eagle, Helvellyn, or even Dunmallard. I appeal on behalf of the residents near Ullswater to the directors and shareholders to reconsider their decision and not to become, together with the boat, objects of ridicule on a subject which can so easily be remedied. And I'm pleased to say remedied it was. Lady of the Lake was eventually chosen, as we know, based on Arthurian legend, and I feel probably more in keeping with the mysteries of Ullswater. She was launched on the 26th of June, 1877, by Miss Williamson. And here again, I'm going to read you another extract because it's the easiest way of dealing with this, from the Cumberland Westman Advertiser this time. On Wednesday last, at 2:30 in the afternoon, a steamboat was launched at Pooley Bridge and received at the hands of Miss Williamson of Ferny Lee the name Lady of the Lake. The launch was witnessed by a goodly number of ladies and gentlemen of the district. The vessel is a handsome little craft constructed on the gondola principle. She is calculated to run at 12 knots with a very small intake of coal. She took to the water in a most handsome manner and was admired by all present for the faultless symmetrical proportions of her lines and the graceful ease with which she floated on the water. Captain Thompson, who was actually from the Enterprise, commands the boat, which will run from Pooley Bridge to Patterdale. After the launching, the gentlemen connected with the vessel and others adjourned to the Crown Hotel, where a cold collation was served and toasts given and responded to. That's the theme of all these launches. I think that reporter may have been slightly, but may have been well entertained by the directors, given the glowing tributes he gives. And I do have here, I'm afraid I don't for the online audience because I couldn't get it to copy properly. I have the original registry certificate for Lady of the Lake if people want to pass it round. I think it's a facsimile, but it's pretty good. But I'm afraid even with Lady, her early years were troubled. She sank at her moorings in 1881. Which one have we up to? Thank you, Tim. You're prejudging me, and I haven't got to say anything, actually. Right, there she is again. That's again at Patterdale Pier. But she sank at her moorings in 1881 and was refloated by divers from Liverpool. Then in 1887, mechanical problems took over, and she was out of action for most of the season. And Thomas Cook, who was now a shareholder, was not at all happy. The tourists were not getting what they wanted and what he advertised. If you could just the next one. And there is an advertisement from a bill that you can see, Cook's Tours, Lake Ullswater, right up the top of Patterdale. He needed to get them to where he was advertising to take them. And so he demanded a backup boat. And in 1889, Raven was ordered from the same TB Seath. Same method of construction as Lady, but technology had moved on in those 12 years, and she's made of steel plate rather than cast iron. She's 111 foot long and weighs 63 tons. And she cost £2,685. And to 2021 money, I think that's just under 400,000. She was launched on the 11th of July, 1889, and here is her registration certificate. She was named after Raven Crag, the house of Major Parkin. Hang on a second, I think, Tim, don't move yet. One of the directors, launched by his 6-year-old daughter, Winifred. And I will again let the Cumberland Westman Advertiser take up the story. After launching, the engines were tested and she moored to the Pooley Bridge Pier. The guests boarded the boat and inspected the saloon and the boat in general. They then proceeded to Howtown with a very full complement of passengers. And Graham tells me he thinks there were 400 on board that day, a lot more than the 240 we feel we can carry in comfort these days, but 400 people. She did the run at 15 miles an hour. The return journey took 22 minutes. It is questionable if there be any boat to beat or even equal this little craft on any lake in the country. Again, a well-entertained journalist. The champagne and cigars were handed out in a sumptuous saloon. Mr. Seath proposed a toast to the Queen. He then proposed a toast to the success of Raven and to its young launcher, and presented Miss Parkin with a bunch of ribbons, which was a Scottish tradition when a young child launched a boat, and an inscribed silver locket to commemorate the event. Major Parkin responded on behalf of his young relative, welcoming Mr. Seath's view that the younger the lady who launched her, the longer would be Raven's life. Hear, hear, said everybody. Mr. Hensman, who was also designed Raven, proposed a toast to Mr. Altman, the company chairman. And Mr. Altman replied, stating the first team of the enterprise had come to grief, but Lady of the Lake was doing well after 12 years. Toasts continued. Mr. Seath said that the Raven was the 270th boat he had built, and there was none finer. He also said that if the railway reached Ullswater, they might need another boat. But it took 100 years for another boat, and the railways never got here. But there we are. In the evening, the workmen, the next slide, please, Tim. Sorry, yes, that's another one of Lady steaming past Calcott Crag. They're fine. And that's the workmen were treated to an excellent supper and jollification at the Sun Hotel. And I think you can see Mr. Seath in the bowler hat at the top there, distinguished looking gentleman. I believe he had a very quick wit. Now, Despite the lyrical views of the Cumberland and Westmoreland Advertiser, there were those who thought that the long, thin greyhound features of Raven were not as attractive as the shorter lady. They also doubted her speed. So on the 23rd of July, 1889, they raced from Sandwich to Glenridding, and Lady arrived first, to the delight of Lady's crew and the distress of Raven's. The next slide, please, is Raven as she is today. Over the years, the configuration of the boat has changed considerably to try and make her more comfortable for passengers and more protection from the elements. But the basic hull is exactly the same. So we then move on into the later Victorian times, and with its two Victorian ladies, the company enjoyed a relatively peaceful end to the century. The peace was occasionally disturbed because they would mount a small cannon on the stern of one of the boats and take it out into the middle of the lake and fire it. And the echoes were sensational. And for the lucky tourist, an experience not to be missed, and you had to count how many you could hear. Another incident which I want to relate is that relating to the 5th Earl of Lonsdale, the Yellow Earl. He, of course, was great friends with Kaiser Wilhelm, Kaiser Bill, and he was invited, the Kaiser was invited to Lowther for shooting in 1895 and 1902. In 1895, Raven became the royal yacht for the visit, and her decks were painted yellow. The royal party travelled on her from Pooley to Howtown, en route to the bungalow at Martindale, which had been specially built as a shooting lodge for the occasion. And this slide purports to show his arrival on the boat at Howtown. And if you look, if you can see a white man sort of just slightly right of the funnel there, I think that's probably him. When you blow it up, it looks as though it could easily be him, but I have no proof, I'm afraid. And just a note about the designation of the Victorian ladies. They were both called motor yachts, and they proudly retain that unusual motor yacht designation. The later vessels, which I shall come to, are just communal garden motor vessels. Motor yachts for the ladies, please. The Ullswater Steam Navigation Company had by this time become a public company and was quoted on the stock exchange. In May 1889, its shares were being traded at £30 for a £25 share. But for some reason in 1904, the rather grandly named Ullswater Navigation and Transit Company was formed, and I think this was a ruse to take the business into private hands. And slide 16, I'm sorry that's very blurred. It's just good. For those who are here, I can hand it round, but it doesn't photocopy very easily. But that's one of the original share certificates made out to Major Parkin, in fact, and it's rather, but they were very fine share certificates. The shareholders were local residents and hotels, many of whose guests arrived by boat. And finally, just to mention, the end of the steam era came in 1934 and 35, when the steam engines were replaced with more efficient diesels. The work was carried out by G&J Thompson, yes, you can move on if you like, and of Penrith. And I'm indebted to Basil Thompson, whose great uncle Joseph owned the firm at the time, for these photographs. And there you see the engine being loaded onto the boat by a very clever thing. And there it is being lowered down a slide into the engine room. Quite a task in those days without a crane. At the same time, those elegant thin steam funnels were replaced with the more bulky funnels we know today. And I'm afraid many residents did not approve. I'd like to move on now to talk about the piers. Traditionally, there have always been 3, Pooley Bridge and Patterdale at either end, and Howtown serving the eastern shore. But there was, as you probably may have noticed in that earlier excerpt, a pier at Lyle's Tower, but I have no idea for how long or what. Initially, Pooley Bridge was the most important because it provided the bunkering for the coal. And that slide, there were iron rails out on the roadside of the hut there, and the coal was brought along by trolley to be loaded onto the boat. But that pier was washed away in the Great Storm of 1931 and had to be rebuilt in 1932. And then, yes, next slide. The pier house was upgraded in 2006, and the old Victorian building was retained, but the coal store, which was on the left-hand side of that photograph, was incorporated into the main ticket office to provide more space, and the pier was extended to give a little more sitting out area just in front of the pier house there. The glass windows give a magnificent view right down the lake, as I'm sure you're all aware. History, of course, repeated itself when the storms of 2009 destroyed the pier again. And to give better resilience, which we're all trying to do nowadays, the old wooden pier, that slide, which I think was rather charming, was rebuilt with steel piles. Sadly, it does not have the same character as the old wooden pier, but if you, next slide, please, but it has stood up much better to the recent storms. Then Glenridding Pier was, as we've seen in those pictures, and I haven't got a picture of the other than the ones you've seen already, was north of the beck initially, in sort of in the gardens of the Inn on the Lake. And I'm not sure when it moved to its current position. But from 1935, with the diesel facilities were provided at Glenridding, and the importance of Pooley Bridge declined, with the majority of visitors joining at Pooley Bridge, at Glenridding. Until recently, really, it was a pretty basic pier house with a square hut with a wooden bench in which passengers could sit in a small office, and tickets were sold on the boat. In 1999, the company decided to build a more modern facility at Glenridding, enabling refreshments and toilets to be provided and tickets sold. And the new pier house was built to the designs of architects Hensman and Walford, but not without controversy. The next slide, please, Tim. The National Park Authority had many concerns. It was described as an upturned Pizza Hut, but eventually it was approved, and we have what we know today. Very recently, plans have been prepared for an extended pier and pier house at Glenridding to provide better facilities, especially in bad weather. And the pier was extended using steel piles over the winter of 2018-19. That proved considerably more expensive than expected. And so the enlargement of the pier house was deferred. And since then, of course, we've had COVID, which has deferred it even more. But the advantages of the new pier are that it can house all vessels in all weathers. And it's much stronger. And the way on and the way off are separate, which has been marvelous for COVID. It was totally unexpected, but it does give you a separate way on and way off. And the disadvantages, as Graham will tell you, is it's more rigid. So if you misjudge your approach to coming alongside, it's much easier to damage the vessel than it was before. Now, the one facility which is unchanged is the slipway. The original at Waterside Farm is still used. Until the 1960s, you see here, there were two rails. So both boats, the two ladies, could be winched up for their winter maintenance at the same time. And the next slide, the one on the left is now out of use, and there is only one rail in use at current time. And there is Raven sitting on it. I want to move now fully into the 20th century activities. The company, throughout the early 20th century, in fact, really until almost all the 20th century, operated in summer only. Its customers were those who came for, firstly those who came for their annual holiday and stayed around the lake. Those who came on organized tours, and we've seen Thomas Cook, who continued on for a long time. And there were organized trips by rail and coach from all over the north of England. Groups such as the Women's Institute, there you see a very fine bevy of Women's Institute. I suspect it has to be. Schools, Boy Scouts, the Rotary, they all came in parties, organized generally by the railways or Ribble Bus. And those were the two biggest customers through most of the 1930s and 40s. There were no private cars, of course, really to speak of, and private visitors did not exist in any volume. During World War II, the activities were scaled back, and the business really was assisted by the transport of military personnel who came to the training camp, which was established at the Ullswater Hotel, which is now the Inn on the Lake. But I'm afraid the problems didn't go away after World War II. Trade became even more difficult, and the popularity of excursions declined. I think competition from other attractions and other destinations was the main cause. And the private cars were still in the 1950s in their infancy. So losses resulted and mounted. And in 1953, the company lost £1,000, which in today's money is about 36,000. And the directors considered winding it up, which is where my grandfather comes into it. He'd been, Wavell Wakefield, he'd been raised near Cartmel. He'd been captain of the England rugby team between 1924 and 27. And he was really, I think, although they didn't think of it in those days, he was a celebrity of his time. By 1954, he was Member of Parliament for St Marylebone in London. He was saddened by the idea of losing such a heritage business, which brought pleasure to many. He had an interest in transport, and he relished a challenge. And he thought much more could be done if the steamers had better promotion and more efficient management. So in 1954, he acquired 97% of the shares and set about reviving the company's fortunes. The remaining 3% were held by individuals who wished to retain an interest, often a sentimental interest. The first change they made was a new distinctive livery. In 1949, Wavell and his wife Doris had been invited on the maiden voyage of Cunard's liner, the HMS Corona. Yes, please. She was a light green hull and a red funnel, and she was nicknamed the Green Goddess. They both loved the livery, and so when the company was bought, they introduced it to Ullswater. And it's been an important part of the brand ever since. Now, initially, they had a bit of luck. In 1955, Donald Campbell was seeking to break the world water speed record. And Wavell, my grandfather, had known Malcolm, his father, quite well. So he offered facilities to Donald Campbell at Glenridding. He thought the steamers would provide a first-class view to the spectators would help them with publicity. And here's a picture of next one, a bluebird on Ullswater. That's just to the north of the current pier house, where a special pier and boathouse was built. Again, this was not very popular with some residents who it did disturb, I think, the peace and quiet of the valley to quite some extent. But on the 23rd of July, Campbell broke the record with a run of 202 miles an hour. And Ullswater and the steamers gained excellent publicity. Another idea to strengthen the business was Era Pier. The coaches often came down the Dockwray Road, and then they went off to Pooley Bridge or down to Glenridding, but those passengers missed out on a lake trip. And my grandfather felt that more would come if they could embark or disembark at Era. So they went to the owners of Laugh's Tower about having a pier in the shelter of Era Point to the north of Era Point, but they got nowhere. So they made an approach to the National Trust for a pier on Era Green, south of Era Point, more exposed, but something was better than nothing. And there were huge arguments which ensued between Cubby Ackland, who was the National Trust director for the Lake District, and my grandfather. The National Trust were adamant it would ruin the area. Both men had a history of mutual antagonism, and they enjoyed a good argument. After 3 years of arguing with Cubby, they got nowhere. And so Waver went off and lobbied his contacts further up the National Trust tree. I think he knew the chairman, but that was still not quick. But in the end, an agreement, a compromise was reached. However, there was still much local opposition. The Ullswater Preservation Society, the Friends of the Lake District, and several others were all against. And when it went for planning permission was turned down. So they had to go to appeal. And the appeal decided in the end to let a pier be built, but only for a 3-year test period. And if it didn't work or was too obtrusive, it had to be dismantled. So 9 years after the idea was first mooted, they were able to proceed. And a pier was constructed at the northern end of Ara Green there. It was a flimsy affair. I'm sorry, this is the only picture I can find of it at all. It was a flimsy affair. I suspect it was flimsy because they realized they might have to take it down again, so they didn't push it in too strongly. And God knows what the health and safety would have thought of it today. I think some of it was sort of floating. It was introduced because of all these delays rather late in the season, and it was in fact then damaged in the winter storms, as you might expect. And also, I think they found that Raven tended to bottom ground when she came in there. So in fact, the idea was abandoned after that first half season. But by then, other factors, which I'll come to, had come into play. For all the 9 years when Ara was under discussion, the company had been loss-making. A huge maintenance backlog from the previous owners on the boats and the piers was a problem. And every year they hoped that improvements would come, but they were hit by something else. It wasn't a new engine or a new piece of steel on the boat. It was bad weather. And so it went on and on. So they never got over that, although they did, the tighter management was introduced. And this lady here did produce a letter talking about Mr. Holliday, who was one of the managers who my grandfather brought in from Kent to try and make things a bit tighter here, I think you might say. Before we move on, just a postscript on Ara. The idea was resurrected in 2010, because by then we got a greater appreciation of the importance of sustainable transport and the need to get people out of their cars if we could, and possibly more onto the boats. So lengthy discussions with the National Trust took place, but this time only 5 years. And a more substantial new pier opened in 2015, just south. The original pier was where that sort of, I think it's a pilot raft is, but it was up that end, just south of where the original one was. And the next slide too, there is Lady Wakefield against it. It's been a favorite with visitors ever since. They enjoy the walk back along the shore, especially if they've got children and things where the walk from Howtown is too long. But it's not long enough to accommodate the Victorian ladies. But I need to return to Lady of the Lake. In 1958, moored at Pooley Bridge with her stern to the wind, when a gale blew up unexpectedly. Now, the Victorian ladies have low freeboards. The distance between the rail of the ship and the lake is actually quite short, quite low. And the waves came up over her stern and sank her. This time, the local fire brigade were called upon and came to the rescue and pumped her out. And she was used again. But 7 years later, in 1965, a disaster struck again. She was on the slipway for winter maintenance when the fire broke out, and she was badly damaged. Now, as you heard, there wasn't enough customers around at that time to justify a rebuild, and so she was left on the slipway for the next 14 years. And there she is, sort of mouldering on the slipway. But domestic tourism did gradually gained strength, fueled by the increasing private car ownership. In 1970, the M6 reached Penrith, making the North Lakes much more accessible for day trips. And by 1976, Raven couldn't cope on her own, and so they started to refurbish Lady. Next slide. She was relaunched in May 1979 by the local MP, Willie Whitelaw, who was at that time Home Secretary. Next slide. There she is as she is today, and she's believed to be the oldest working passenger vessel in the world. So I'm going to move on now to the new boats, because by the 1990s, the lengthening summer season and the popularity of walking led the directors to consider the possibility that there was a future in all the year-round working. And the Victorian ladies with their low freeboard were not suited to rough winter weather. So the company sought a seagoing vessel to test the market, and Lady Dorothy, please, was purchased from Guernsey. She'd been built in 1967 and had run day trips to Herm and Sark. She's 50 foot long and 13 tons and has a capacity of 60. And she was brought up on a low loader from Poole and craned onto the lake at Stybarrow Crag. Now, she arrived at a bad time. March 2001 was right in the middle of the foot and mouth epidemic. But anyway, she was sent to the slipway, where extensive interior, generally remodeling. I mean, if you compare the previous one with that one, quite a different looking vessel, to bring it to the sort of standard expected on Ullswater. She entered service in the autumn of 2001, when luckily the effects of foot and mouth were wearing off, and she was instant success. And we found immediately there was good demand for winter work. But she is the only wooden boat in the fleet. And as such, she has to spend about 2 months every year on the slipway drying out. You might think that's something that only maniacs do, but Lady Dorothy does too. As a result, the company was soon looking for another seaworthy boat to spread the load and operate when she was drying out, and with more inside space to protect passengers from winter and weather. It was a lengthy search, but in 2006, next slide please, the Totnes Castle came up for sale in Plymouth. She'd been built in 1949 and had worked as a pleasure boat on the Tamar, the Dart and the Medway. And she'd variously been called the Berry Castle, the Golden Cormorant and the Totnes Castle. None were felt suitable for Ullswater, and I don't think we thought of the Penrith Castle. So she was rechristened Lady Wakefield after my grandmother Doris. They sailed her up from Plymouth to Whitehaven, I think a house's journey for a boat which was not in great shapes. But there are people who specialize in that sort of work. She was put on a low loader and craned again onto Ullswater at Stybarrow Crag. And the rest of 2006 was spent on the slipway being refitted by the company's own staff. She's 67 foot long, 50 tons, and carries 150 passengers. And she was relaunched by Princess Alexandra in April 2007. Shortly after that, in 2008, the company was contacted by the owners of Western Bell. She'd been built in 1937 and had worked in Plymouth in the West Country, but she'd ended up at Hampton Court doing parties and weddings and things. And the owners wanted to retire, and they thought for some reason that Ullswater Steamers would make a good home for her. But at first sight, she wasn't really very promising. I agree to that. But we went down and saw her, and we were able to see through the disguise and realized that underneath she had lines that would fit in well with the aspirations for the fleet. So although we weren't ready for her, we only just got the other one, she was bought, she was sailed to Maryport, all the way from the Thames, a really hazardous journey for a thing looking like that. She was stored at Maryport, in Maryport Harbour for a year. we realized we didn't have the resource to refurbish her on our slipway. So in 2009, she was sailed back to Liverpool, and there she was sympathetically restored by the Mersey Heritage Ship Repair Company and returned to Ullswater on a low loader and craned onto the lake. Now, I just wanted to explain, I've talked several times about craning onto the lake. This is really quite a complex exercise because the Highways Authority will only allow the road to be closed so you can get in and out between something like 1 o'clock in the morning and 7 o'clock or 6:30 in the morning. And you've got to get a big crane down, assembled, lift the boat, get the boat down, get the boat lifted in, and the big crane retracted and taken down again and out in that short period. So it's quite a thing. And the boat has to go in at about 4:30 in the morning, just as the sun is rising. So there you can see Western Belle being craned onto the lake, and there the crane is being taken away, and she is for the first time floating on the lake without the superstructure, without the wheelhouse and things. Those are put on later. So she is 56 tons, 70 foot long, and 147 passengers. Very similar, in fact, to Lady Wakefield. And there she is. She's been proved very popular in the public, and I think she fits in beautifully with the rest of the fleet. And the relaunching was carried out by Jane McCosh from Dalmain, who've always been a very good friend of the steamers. Just to touch now on the floods, because you all know about those and the history of those, but the floods of 2009 and 2015 did seriously affect the steamers, damaging the piers, the pier houses, and in 2015, next slide please, the access road to Glenridding Pier. Oh no, well that's the pier house, sorry, and there's the access road, right, sorry. So some pretty damaged assets, and Lady Wakefield, no, these are never mind. Lady Wakefield, when was moored on the new strong pier at Cooley Bridge. Can you go back to couple? You see her waving around. There she is. She's waving around the painter, the front painter row, and she banged on the pier, and she seemed to be taking water when they went and looked at her. So they took her, unhitched her, and beached her on the land just down by the slipway. But when the water receded, she was high and dry, some 20 meters from the lake. And the question was how to get her back there. The damage was not severe, but in the end, the Dutch salvage company, the ones that refloated the Costa Concordia in Italy, were found located, and they had the answer. And the next slide, they rolled her back on inflatable rubber sausages. And it was very successful. One thing, of course, which was good, which came out of Storm Desmond, was the development of the Ullswater Way, to which this organization is committed and has done so much for. But the steamers too have fully committed to it. And we found it to be, it's obviously been extremely popular with walking visitors. Walkers, in fact, have become a mainstay of the business. And in recognition of this, Ullswater Steamers has for many years contributed 10p from walkers' tickets. That's single to Howtown or Howtown to Glenridding single, to footpath maintenance in the valley. And so far, some £45,000 has been raised in this way. Just a brief bit about visitors. Throughout its history, Ullswater Steamers has hosted many important visitors, some come incognito and we don't really know and are not recognized, but some are recognized. One skipper, I think, was very surprised when the Prime Minister, John Major, emerged unannounced from the undergrowth and trees at Howtown and got on board and was very affable all the way down. Another visitor, you can tell me who this is. Who is the man on the left? No? It's his Sir Tony Robinson, Baldrick from Blackadder, there with Christian, our senior skipper. Of those we have actually known about, I've already mentioned the Kaiser and Princess Alexandra. Also in the summer of 2001, when we needed a boost for tourism after the end of Foot and Mouth, we had, next slide, Tony Blair visited the county, and he was allowed a short spell at the wheel. Then in 2009, Prince William paid a flying visit. He'd been up on Helvellyn for the morning with mountain rescue teams, and he came on to visit a party of very sick children being supported by Wellchild, a charity of which he was patron. The party was travelling on a normal scheduled service along Ullswater. Thank you. The Prince joined by jumping aboard off the rib. I'm sure he shouldn't have been allowed to do that, but that's what happened. And he spent 20 minutes. Oh, wait, Mum, go back, please. Sorry. Spent 20 minutes with these very ill children and their families, and it was much appreciated. I think the American couple who was sitting on deck for a normal tour up the lake must have been really rather, I don't suppose they could have believed their luck when they found the Prince was on board. And I think we should have a new slogan, travel on Ullswater and meet a Prince. Because of course the next important visitor who I want to mention was in March 2018, when the Prince of Wales came on board Lady for a relaxed trip from Glenridding to Pooley Bridge. It was supposed to, it's his 70th birthday, so he was keen to do something relaxing. He spent time in the wheelhouse with Christian Grammar, and they much enjoyed that. And then he met people from the valley. Thank you. Many who've been involved with the recovery from Storm Desmond, and he met them down in Saloon. And there is Jane McCosh asking him to taste the winner from the Commonwealth class in the Marmalade Festival. He was persuaded, he's looking a bit dubious, and rightly so, he was persuaded to do so, but for some reason he must have picked with that spoon the only pip in the jar, and he spent the next 2 minutes trying to pick out this pip. Luckily, by the time he got upstairs, next morning to unveil black, he got rid of it all. I just wanted to touch on the staff, because really the business is made in the end, not by its boats or by its piers, but by its staff. And we've had many great characters over the years. I sadly know very little about the early ones. The first captain of Enterprise was Captain Corbett. And then in 1870, he was succeeded by Captain Thompson, yes please, from Windermere. And he went on to Captain Lady. And we have his appointment letter, which says, I have to inform you that you've been appointed by the general meeting of the shareholders of the company at Pooley Bridge to be captain of the Enterprise, an agreement to be entered into for 12 months. You may make arrangements to come as soon as possible. Let me hear from you in the course of the next few days. So he was actually, I mean, he stayed for a good sight longer than 12 months. The first captain that I remember is Captain Bagley. And there is Bill Bagley. He was an affable pipe smoker, and he lived in the captain's house. The company's always had a captain's house in Pooley Bridge, down Finkel Street there. And he was the captain through the 50s and 60s. And the next slide shows him being presented on his retirement. And I put that in because it shows the 3 sisters, my mother and her 2 sisters, but also Alan Kirkup, who succeeded him as captain, and sadly died when he was painting, when he drowned, when painting one of the boats on the pier at Glenridding. Over the years, we've been lucky to attract staff who have great affinity to the business and to the valley. And they've been able to pass on to their passengers their knowledge and their enthusiasm. And I think they've greatly enhanced the pleasure which our visitors get from a travel on the steamers. We had both older retired people who want part-time outdoor work in the beautiful surroundings, and students who look for summer work. And I have to say, some of those students stay forever. That's for a full lifetime, which is magnificent. For a fleet, a heritage fleet, which has to run 360 days per annum, maintaining it is terribly important. and meeting the quality requirements, our own quality requirements, and the stringent regulations of the Marine and Coast Guard Agency. So the chief engineer post and the assistant engineers are vital, and we've been blessed with some excellent engineers. And currently we have Barry Crellin, who's been in the boat for some years now, who came from the North Sea oil field supply vessels. So the business today, next slide, please. From being on the verge of closure in 1952, it's now, I think, an integral part of the Lake District and the Ullswater community. I like to think so. A much loved attraction and a string that connects the tourism in the valley together. 5 heritage vessels operating every day except Christmas Day and Christmas Eve, weather permitting, carries 250,000 passengers, 220 permanent staff, 14 seasonal, and it's a significant contributor to the local economy. What I think is terribly important, though, is that it's environmentally conscious. And we recognize that the landscape with which we operate is absolutely critical to the business and the maintenance of that landscape. So we have the Green Tourist Business Gold Award and the Green at Heart accreditations for best environmental practice, and internationally recognized in the World Responsible Tourism Awards under the Sea and River Cruise category. And then in 2016, we were awarded the Large Visitor Attraction of the Year in the Cumbria Tourism Awards. And I thought I should finish, you'll be glad to hear, with, in 2019, the company celebrated 160 years since Enterprise first plied Ullswater and 130 years of Raven. And so a celebration was held with all 5 boats out on the water with 5 different parties on board, but they met in Hightown Bay and performed a cartwheel. And there's a little video of this. Quite fun. But I just wanted to end, not with that, but my favorite picture, which reminds us, I think, of the tiny part the steamers play in this majestic landscape. It's a wonderful picture, isn't it? That's it.
Peter, that was magnificent. I mean, you've seen an icon in action, and you are an icon as well in terms of
don't do that.
No, in terms of your commitment to preserving and maintaining the amazing heritage of the valley. I'm touched every time I see the steamers operating. I think it's wonderful that we should be so lucky in this valley to have such an extraordinary historical sort of historically important heritage, and it's a living heritage. It's not something which is dead. It's actually live, and as you mentioned, the staff are so important to that. So a great tribute to see Ron here today, and others. I think I just feel blown over by the extraordinary things you brought to the valley and the community, and an international traffic that comes here. You mentioned 250,000 people, visitors here. I thought it was much more than that. Actually. It should be more than that because I think it's.
And even that's really a cheat. The way that the steamer companies calculate this is every time you get on, you're counted as a passenger. So if you go up to Pooley Bridge and they throw you off for lunch and you get on again and come back again, you're actually two people. So, but that's the way everybody does it. But,
and it's a wonderful thing to be responsible for and to keep going so long, obviously through very difficult times as well. There have been lots of ups and downs.
Yeah.
And it's so exciting. Are there any queries, questions, intriguing facts you want to throw at him? Weight of the people in this room or anything like that? Please do.
My dad was he told me that the rate sank in Brazil about 1935, something like that. And it was better the whaling, not the rate. And do you know anything about that?
Just to repeat the question, so someone was asking about the possible sinking of the Raven. Did it happen or not?
in the 1930s. 1935. Not aware of it. I've not seen it recorded anywhere. But that doesn't mean to say it didn't happen. It's just we have no record of it. But no, sorry. If you can get me a picture, I'd be delighted to see it. Yeah. No, afraid not.
Any other questions? Please.
I've been to the end of Lucy level, the green side, and the bottom house and things work inside flooded. Tended to set an explosion.
The question relates to the Glenreading mine, lead mine, and one entrance to that mine is through the Lucy's tunnel, Lucy's entrance, and there's a question related to an explosion.
They intended to send an explosion up there, and then they could take measurements away from there in case an atomic bomb.
That's right.
But not an explosion went off. And it caused water to come in, and now there's 1,000 feet of water. I think over explosives which didn't work.
I know very little, but you'll have to ask an expert on the green side. I'm sure there are people who know a lot about it, but that could quite easily have happened. And even if it didn't happen then, I think when the national park wanted to close the mine completely and stop people going in, they would have been very glad if it had happened and stopped people. And you can still get into the top levels, I know, but I think the fewer people that get in from their point of view, the better.
We have a question on the Zoom. It's a sustainable transport. An earlier sailing, question mark, 9:45.
Commuters, that's something. But do you think we get enough commuters to make it viable? That's the trouble, isn't it? But can I say we bear it in mind? But it's getting everybody up and going, because if you need a crew, I mean, to sail just one boat, you need at least 3 people and probably 4, because you need somebody on the shore, and then you need at least 2 crew, depending on which boat you're on. So it would be difficult, I think. And what would the commuter do when they got to Pooley Bridge, I wonder? Anyway, not thought about at the moment, but certainly worth considering if business is there.
There's actually a discussion going on at the moment, as you know, about how to integrate better the steamers, buses, flights, train timetables, and so on. There's quite a live discussion taking place at the moment, and even if it's commercially difficult, I mean, it's the sort of thing which probably deserves subsidies of some sort. So I think the notion of having more sustainable transport on the lake, with the steamers playing a central role in that, is very much on the order of the day. But obviously, you have commercial interests you have to maintain. It's very difficult. Are there any other questions on Zoom?
No more questions. Someone else has chipped in. How would you the we heard from Julie Bridge?
From Pulley Bridge, right, that way.
Actually, there's another question which has been raised in relation to this role of the steamers, and that is whether it's feasible to have smaller boats that are more or less commuter boats, not the larger Ullswater Steamer type vessels, smaller for commuting to get one side of the lake to the other very rapidly and so on, and maybe small piers and so on to promote that, but still food for thought. And if you have to go 9 years, consultation to get there, it's probably mission impossible. Any more comments?
I don't think we'd want it to get quite like Derwentwater, though, where the boat is stopping every 10 minutes or 5 minutes. I mean, there are so many piers. It would take you ages to get up the lake if you had too many piers. The only pier that I think is of interest at the moment, other than extending Era, which is we need really to be able to get the Victorian ladies in there, so we need a bigger pier. The only other place where it might be useful to put a pier is Sandwich Bay, and it has been talked about, but it's just talk.
Can I ask a question around whether or not you're going through a process as well of electrification of having? I know it's a live topic at the moment.
Very much so. It's a question of when to dive in, really, because the technology is improving all the time. And if you dive in too early, you get technology which isn't really up to it. And you think, oh gosh, I wish we waited another 3 years or something and done it a bit later. But I can see that happening. They went to steam to diesel at some stage. I suspect they'll go from diesel to electric. But the experience for the passenger of the comparatively silent thing is wonderful. But it's just getting the technology to a stage where, but I think you need to watch this space on that one. We're certainly thinking about it.
The person who asked about the scene from the Grave, I was just wondering, Peter, if it was the late 30s, there was a chap called Lord Hawthorne who did all of the German propaganda and everything else. Steamers and Ullswater, Lord Hawthorne actually listed that. So whether somebody thought he was threatening to see them, surprised I didn't record what he said, prosecuting him later.
I thought Graham was going to tell us then about, because the one thing I didn't touch on, because it would have taken another few minutes, was the end of Enterprise. Because nobody quite knows what happened to Enterprise. And I think the last suggestion that Graham was putting forward to me was that actually she was beached somewhere, and in the end, in the 39-45 war, when they were, no, the First World War, when they were looking for, they needed metal to build up munitions with, that she was cut up and sent off to, but we don't really know where she is.
No, I was talking to Peter about this the other day, because I went through all the newspapers in Kent Library that used to have more microfilm between 1877 and 1889, because when Lady was launched, there's an article in the paper that says there will now be 2 steamers in Ullswater. When Reagan was launched, 13 years later, there will again be 2 steamers in Ullswater. So within that 13 years, Enterprise went out of service, because that's the definite time that she was there and she wasn't. And it was later, and nothing else in the newspapers told us. There was no disasters, there was nothing reported, and it would have been. Probably a very old farming part of it. His grandfather said that Enterprise was pulled onto the shore near water,
and sat there for years, which would make sense. And then when the first World War broke out, and then took all the railings down around the country and all stuff, let's have to repair. The locals broke up what was left of it before that, which would make sense. But there's no proof. And our science can't tell about those.
Last question for me. Is there a natural limit to the life of a vessel on a freshwater lake? I mean, Lady is now 167.
No, 160.
I mean, how much longer can she go? Or is it possible with modern maintenance to keep her alive?
It depends how much.
Forever.
It depends what.
I think with modern maintenance, I mean, although the hull is the same in shape, almost all the bottom has been replaced with modern metal in recent years. And I think it's possible to go on renewing forevermore, if that's what you want to do. But,
on Lady of the Lake, especially with iron and fresh water, she's really done well. I mean, there's an awful lot of it still riveted, original but you know, that was a lot of chipping and painting to keep that up. Although there's now more modern paints going on and so on. But yeah, it's almost indefinite, I would have thought. Again, renovation wouldn't be good. But that is not the best.
Any more on Wilson? So I think on that note, please join with me in thanking Peter again for an absolutely wonderful presentation. A couple of other points. Firstly, if you'd like to make any donations, 50% will go to the Friends of the Ullswater Way and 50% to the charity of Peter's choice.
Lake District Foundation. Foundation, which is doing a wonderful job raising money for landscape and environment.
For those here, there is a little sheet over there, which you may wish to make a contribution to. Then the last thing I wanted to say is that we had originally foreseen a talk on June the 2nd, but it's a public holiday. It's the prolonged May public holiday, so we think probably, particularly in the light of the Jubilee celebrations, we should give it a miss. And our next talk will be something we haven't tried before, which will be a debate between Dave Felton, the publisher of Inspired by Lakeland, and Mark Richards, the author of the latest, his latest book called The Walking Companion for Ullswater. So we'll have two people sort of doing a double act. They do an excellent podcast at the moment. We thought we'd try that type of interactive discussion, and that will take place on the 7th of July, and it will take place here in Glenveagh. So on that note, thank you very much indeed for coming, and thank you to the Zoom audience and to the team putting all this together. Thank you.